there, Junior Rangers. Welcome to this week's art demonstration focusing on rhinos and conservation. So today what we thought we would do is create a 3D sculpture of sorts using salt dough. So there are a couple of things we'll need to get together for this project. The first being just some ordinary cake flour. This is what people used to bake with. And you will need some salt. Any kind of fine iodized or non-iodized table salt is perfect. You will need a mixing bowl, a wooden spoon. We'll be using our hands too. You'll need some water and some measuring cups. These measuring cups are going to be used in various amounts. I'm going to use a cup and a half a cup measure. And later for the decorating part, I might use a skewer, some leaves or natural things that I could find in the garden, and these will give nice textures to my rhino later. So if you want to go and find the things that you might need, come and meet me back here in a couple of minutes and we'll go through the recipe for our salt dough. So Junior Rangers, now for the salt dough recipe I mentioned earlier. What we'll need is to measure out 2 cups of flour. This is for sort of moderately sized salt dough recipe. You can always double it if you would like to. So measure as accurately as you can. I might just use the smaller measure to help me fill this up neatly so I don't make too much mess. Okay, get it as accurate as possible. Doesn't have to be exactly right. So 2 of these. Luckily, most of these ingredients you'll have at home anyway, so you shouldn't need to go out and buy anything new. So we put 2 cups of flour into the bowl, the mixing bowl, and now I'm going to add half a cup of salt. So again, it's important to get your measurements as close to the mark as possible. So you're going to put your salt in, make sure it's level at the top of your measuring cup. Okay, that looks about right. So I'm going to add that to my salt. Just remember when you are mixing these that your hands are going to dry out quite a lot. That is usual. And just be careful of any little cuts and things you may need to be careful of in terms of the salt going inside. So remember, now it's 3/4 cup of water. I haven't got a 3/4 cup with me, so I'm going to do 1.5 of these half cups. Time to be experimental with your maths and art today. So I'm going to measure about half a cup. All right. Now, I'm going to mix this up. So, Junior Rangers, how I'm going to mix this first is to use a wooden spoon, but it's really useful to get your hands involved later. So you see, I'll just mix it up carefully, trying not to make a mess. If it is too watery, which my recipe might be for now, we can always add a little bit of water later, but you really don't want this dough to be too wet. Otherwise, it won't hold the shapes that we'll try to make later. Okay, maybe it's not too bad. So we're going to give this a good mix around, and then I'm going to get in there with my hands. All right, you probably have to knead this mixture for a good 10 minutes. So it's a good opportunity to get those hands and fingers nice and strong. Quite a nice tactile activity for you to do. Okay, and kneading this dough together means you're mixing all those parts really nicely into one ball. Junior Rangers, even though it might look like your dough is very crumbly and dry, you just keep going with it. Eventually that water will activate as it needs to, and your dough will become quite a good solid ball. All right, so don't add water until about 10 minutes of kneading it nicely, really getting in there and squishing that dough so that it starts to form that ball. I'll go and pick up a little bit more of the crumbs in the bottom and knead them in. Junior Rangers, just for the sake of time, I might just wet my fingertips just to add a little bit of water. I don't want to add any more water than that. It'll just help that last little bit of dough come together. So if you use the palm of your hand to really mush it, you might feel like you have more power. One more little dip of my fingers, just the tips of my fingers really, and we're almost good to go. All right, so I hope you've caught up to the step, Junior Rangers, and you're ready to create your 3D rhino. But if you haven't, why don't you pause the video for a second and get to the same point as me. All right, Junior Rangers, now that our dough is ready to work with, I want you to think very carefully about how you're going to construct your 3D rhino. It's always a good idea to think about where you want your artwork to go before you start. So I often say that it's a better idea to pull out your different features from the ball of clay rather than to try and stick on different parts later. So this is quite a fun exercise in pulling out different parts of your rhino. So I'm starting with the legs here. They don't really look like much leg, but I will eventually get them nice and smooth. It's maybe a good idea to keep your water just to dip your fingers into if your dough starts to crack and get very dry. This is dough that I made a bit earlier this morning, so it might just need a little bit of water every now and then. You can see how that's smoothed down nicely if I just tapped my finger in the water and did that. All right, so remember, if your rhino is anything like this guy, or rhinos in the wild, they are very big, sturdy creatures. So you're going to have to do those legs in quite a solid, sturdy way too. Otherwise your rhino will not be able to stand later. All right, so perhaps I'll make my rhino sitting down with his back legs so that he can sort of perch like that. You can see, so he won't need 4 very strong legs. Maybe he can be sitting on his very round bottom. So now I'm going to pull out a little bit of the face of the rhino. Okay, remember again, every rhino will look different and your rhino is no exception. Everyone's got a very different style, and working in 3D is completely different to drawing. So you can see I'm actually going to try something. I pinched off a little bit of his head there, and I'll smooth it down again to make him complete. But I want to try and stick on a rhino horn, because we know that rhinos are so sought after in the wild by poachers because of their precious rhino horns. So I'm sure you've learned all about rhinos and know much more than I do right now, but we know that rhino horns are of more value when they are attached to these magnificent animals. So you can see I'm trying to think of the shape that I want to use. It's maybe a bit of a triangular shape, maybe slightly pointy at the end. And I'm going to smooth it down a bit because I want to be able to attach it over there. My rhino is just going to have one big horn on it. This is where you might want to use your society stick. When you want to attach different parts, you have to make them a little bit rough before you stick them on. Think of it like soccer boots or football boots. If you don't have those treads, they are very difficult to run on grass with. So you can see I've made it a bit rough there, and I've made it rough on the horn. Now I'm going to stick it down and smooth all the edges, just like I would with ceramic clay. Okay, and I'm using a rolling motion with this. You can also use your fingers. I just like the stick because it's a little bit smaller and can grab more of that dough. Okay, Junior Rangers, now you can see I've smoothed down the edges and I've really made sure that this rhino horn is attached nicely to my rhino's nose. I know he still looks a little bit like a lump, but hopefully we'll start seeing him take shape soon. So the next thing I want to think about is maybe his ears. So I'm going to try that pinching motion again, and I'm just going to make little rhino ears coming out of his head. Now, rhino ears aren't as big as elephant ears, so I'm going to think about what size and shape I want to create. Don't make these things too thin. They will break off quite easily later when it's dry, and also you'll find the cracks form pretty easily when the shapes are very thin. So if you have pinched something too thin, just fold it in and keep pinching out from that solid head shape. All right, so now you can see I've got one ear formed. I'm going to do it to the other side too. So remember, it's quite nice to swap hands and use your rhino in different positions so that you can easily get to the side that you're working on. And don't be scared if cracks form. Remember, we can always fix them. This dough is very flexible, so you can always shape it again later. All right, so again, I'm just using little dots of water when it becomes very cracked so that my dough can just mold together a little bit more. All right, so you can see I've just been dabbing my finger into water every now and then when there were little cracks forming in my rhino. Remembering to pull out your little features from the solid rhino blob as he is now, and really thinking about where your rhino is going. Okay, so Junior Rangers, I know this is not an easy task, but remember, if you do make a mistake, it's absolutely fine. You can just go back and start again. My rhino's got a little bit of a face and ears and a horn. I'm going to possibly leave the back of him quite simple and just make sure that he is kind of crack free if I can, and maybe just pull out those legs slightly, pretending that he's sitting down on his enormous behind, just enjoying nature and the sunshine perhaps. Okay, so again, I'm just pulling out his legs from the big lump of dough. Okay, because we're working with quite a big lump of dough, this is going to take a while to dry. So today's project will not be able to be completed in one sitting. You're going to have to make your rhino and do the decorating or painting of it another time. So again, I'm pulling out and pinching, smoothing, dipping my finger in water when needed, but not taking too much. You can see I want my rhino to remain quite dry, otherwise it starts losing its shape. All right, so I'm just doing the second leg here, and then I'm going to start thinking about how to decorate it, add things like the rhino's eyes and maybe its little tail. All right, so I'll check that he's stable and able to stand, smooth him down. All right, so now I want to work on my tail. So again, I'm just picking up my rhino quite carefully, holding him in my hand so that he doesn't start falling around the place, because if he was to fall on his head now, he would get flattened. So I'm holding it nicely in my one hand, and then I'm pushing and pulling out his tail from the back end. All right, now I'm not going to make the tail too thin and narrow because then it will break off. So I want to keep it quite large and just smoothing it down all the time so that those cracks don't become larger as it dries. All right, so again, just smooth down any cracks that may come up and that you see. All right, you can turn it over. I quite like that he's got all these irregular bumps on his body, because rhinos often look like look to me like they've got armor around them. Their skin is made up of that sort of rough, bumpy texture and looks like they're wearing their own armor, fit for battle. So if your rhino looks a little bit like that, that sounds good to me. All right, this tail is not behaving too well, so I'm going to keep him very short and stumpy. You can see what you can achieve. All right, so why I mentioned getting the skewer earlier was maybe to do things like doing your rhino's eyes, maybe doing details like his nostrils later. Okay, you can use it on the pointy end or on the back end where there is a little bit of a rounded bump. So it's a very useful tool to use. So I'm just putting in his nostrils like that. Use it in a twisting motion or a poking motion. Okay, I'm going to try and get his eye in the same sort of place. Okay, I always think of rhinos as being very wise creatures. So I'm trying to give him wise, smiling eyes. Right. And I know that there is a difference between the black and the white rhino's lips. So you can decide what kind of rhino your rhino is going to be. But again, you can see I'm just using that as a rolling motion and I'm creating a mouth for my rhino. All right. So now what you can do is you can decide what kind of pattern you would like to do on your rhino's body. Perhaps you want to use your stick, or perhaps you want to use your leaves. All right, Junior Rangers, these are just leaves that I found in my garden, but you are welcome to go and look at what incredible textures you might find in nature. We also could use something like the rough bark of a piece of wood to make imprints on your rhino's body. So for now, I'm going to use this texture of the fern, and I'm just going to make imprints on my rhino's body just by pressing in firmly but gently, not letting it move around, and let's see what happens. So I'm pressing it in, not too deep. I don't want to change the whole shape of my rhino's body, but I would like the leaves to feature. Let's see if it's worked. So now you can see he's got a bit of a leaf print on him. That might be quite fun to do later. We'll paint in with paints later. Different types of leaves will have different types of vein structures on them, so they'll appear different if you use them on the veiny side. So you can see that one's more of a subtle print, so you can decide what you want to do. Otherwise, you can also use your skewer sticks or other things that you found and make patterns on your rhino. Your rhino doesn't have to look like a normal natural rhino in the wild. You can have a bit of fun creating different textures and patterns on the surface of your rhino if you would like to. Maybe your rhino has been in a couple of territorial battles with other rhinos and has a few scars and scrapes on him. So you can see I'm actually just trying to do a bit of a leaf pattern. Maybe you could do small dots to display the rhino's armor of sorts with its skin, and decide what you want to do. Junior Rangers, I'm very excited to see what kind of patterns you choose to do on your rhinos and what these rhinos end up looking like. Before I go, I just want to show you one other option that you could do for this project if you aren't managing too easily with the rhino's 3D body. You could also make flat rhinos by rolling out the salt dough and creating shapes that you can then string up with a piece of string. So I'm going to put this rhino here. Once this rhino is dry, maybe it'll take a week or two because he's quite a thick one, we can also put him in the oven for a little while. To dry out your rhino, you might want to set your oven to 150 degrees Celsius or 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Leave it for 30 minutes, checking every now and then to see if it's drying adequately. If it is as thick as this rhino, it might need at least an hour in the oven, and maybe another little while just to dry out completely in a cool, warm place. In a warm shaded place, not in the direct sunlight. All right, and when it's completely dry, then you can use paints to decorate your Rhino in all sorts of colors. But Junior Rangers, again, if you're not ready to do a 3D Rhino like that, perhaps you would like to do some Rhino decorations that you could hang up, as I said. All right, maybe I'll take a small piece. All right, Junior Rangers, if you'd like to try a different type of Rhino project, you can always use a small bit of your salt dough to make a different kind of Rhino. So I'm going to move this guy out of the frame, and now we're just going to focus on flattening this part of the dough out. All right, you can use the base of your hand to really smooth it out. If you've got a rolling pin, you're welcome to use that, or a bottle perhaps, if you rolled it on its side, could create the same sort of effect. So you kind of want it to be of a similar thickness throughout your dough. Okay, so you don't want one side really thick and the other side really thin. You want it kind of the same thickness all the way through. Maybe about 1 centimeter would be a good measure. All right, now this is where your skewer stick would come in, or poke a drawing of a Rhino into your salt dough. So I'm going to use this to make the little ear. That was the beginnings of my horn. Maybe the Rhino's lips. You can see how I'm just doing these dots quite close together but not touching, and that creates the effect of a drawing on the salt dough. So I'm not going to be able to fit my entire Rhino onto this picture, I don't think, onto this salt dough. So it's okay if your picture goes off the sides a little bit. If you wanted to cut out your Rhino shape, that's also something you could consider doing. So you're the artist, it's completely up to you what your artwork ends up looking like. So now I'm coming up from one of his legs into his nice round belly. And I'll come back to where his back is. All right, so now if I was going to leave this as a round circle, I think I should fix up the sides of it, really try and get rid of those cracks. A useful thing to do is to maybe even use the back of your nail and just smooth down those edges. You can see it gives it quite a nice flat look. So use a bit of water if you need to and smooth down those edges that way. All right, now again, maybe I can do a bit of an imprint and make this a little bit more interesting. So again, I'm just pressing in quite firmly with my fern and making the imprint. Okay, gently lifting that. You don't want to leave the fern behind like I just did. If you have, it's a good idea to take it out now, because if you leave it in there, it's going to dry with your salt dough. All right, so I'm sure you can come up with much more creative things to do with your Rhino in terms of the drawing and the imprints. I'm going to leave that up to you. But once you've finished your design, maybe you can get an adult to help you, or you can try yourself, try to make a hole through it so that you can tie it up later as a decoration. Don't do the hole too close to the edge, because then it'll end up breaking through and not being able to be hung up. So maybe make a hole around about there and maybe twist the skewer as you're going down. You could always use a pencil for this. It might be the right width to get a ribbon through later. Or you could do what I'm doing and use a skewer and gently just wind that skewer around so that you make that circle slightly bigger as you go. All right, maybe check from the other side. Do the same sort of thing. And also very important, check the back of your work for any cracks or breaks in that salter, because those will also affect your artwork as it dries. So again, use a little bit of water if you need to, and the back of your fingernail to really squish those cracks together. Smooth them down nicely, and I'm sure it'll all work out well. All right, Junior Rangers, I can't wait to see what you guys come up with, be it a very chunky 3D rhino or a rhino decoration that you can use string to hang up later. I'm sure you're going to come up with very creative projects. Please don't forget to upload them. We love seeing what you've made. And I hope you've enjoyed this demonstration. I'll see you soon.